how we can consume that data using Angular services and even data bind the data into our templates and components. Now we're going to start off with a look at the different get actions we need for the apps. We'll learn how to get customers, get a single customer, as well as how to get states. We'll also talk about how we can make GET requests with an Angular service, and we'll talk about observables again and review how those are going to be used and the role they play. From there, we're going to switch gears to using the Angular service to consume the data, get that observable back and subscribe to it in a component, and then render the data in a grid. And then we'll wrap up by looking at some different techniques that can be used to render a single customer in a form. We're going to talk about a template-driven approach and a reactive forms approach. Let's go ahead and get started by building out pieces of our RESTful service. One of the first things we need to do is enhance our RESTful service to return customer data to whoever calls into the service. Now for this app, it's going to be Angular, but technically it could be any type of client capable of using HTTP to call into this service. So I'm going to show you some code that'll map a route to a function, which will then call into MongoDB, get our data, return it as JSON, and then later we'll jump into the Angular 2 code, consume that data, and then display it. So let's go ahead and jump in and see how we can do some routing here. So earlier I mentioned that the application has a convention-based routing approach. It looks in this controllers folder, and the subfolders are put together to create these routes. So we'd have API/customers, or API/states, or API/tokens. And we'll be talking about all these as we move along through the course. But in this one, we want to focus on this file, which is at the root of this route, API/customers. Now you'll see this is just an ES 2015 class, nothing special. I could have even just chosen to use regular functions, but it's going to be responsible for accepting a router. This is passed in as the router does its convention-based routing, and then mapping incoming routes to functions. And then the functions will be our actions that return the data. So we have MongoDB, and although I'm not going to write the code for that part of it, since this course is about RESTful services in Angular, I do want to show you the basics. So if I go into the models folder, you'll notice I have this customer.js, and it's importing the Mongoose module that I mentioned earlier in the course. Now this is one of many modules you could use to query MongoDB, but Mongoose has this schema property or object you can use. Then we're also importing another model object that's related to Mongoose here for a state. And this is really how the data is going to be stored in MongoDB. So how the fields are going to be laid out. So for a given order, I'm going to have a product, price, and quantity. For a customer, I'm going to have first name, last name, email, and then some complex types. A state that could have an ID in it. In fact, I can show you right here, an ID, abbreviation, and name. Whereas the customer, you'll see, is kind of the normal customer type of fields, plus a state object, and you can have an orders object, an array of orders, which is our order schema. So this is kind of how you can use Mongoose to define the structure of the data that's going to be stored in the database. Now what you'll do from there is you'll take that schema and then plug it into a Mongoose model. This is actually how we'll query a collection that'll be called customers as it gets created in MongoDB. But this is actually how we're going to query the database through this. So that's kind of the first thing you do with Mongoose is you set up your schemas and your models, then you can write some code to actually query those models. So the way we do that is through the lib, and our library of modules here has a customers repository, and I can do things like get customers. Now this is going to import our customer model. Notice I then use that to get the count of the customers and also find all the customers. This little object literal here means I don't have any type of query I'm doing as far as a where clause, a predicate, so it's going to grab all of them. Now, assuming it works, this is really what we're after. We want to return to the caller of this get customers the number of customers and the actual customer data, the array of customers. All right, so that code is already in place. Now what we're going to do is use that code in our customer controller that handles the incoming routes and creates this RESTful service. So now that we have the schema and a way to actually query the model and get the data back from the database, we can come into here. First thing we need to do, we need to import our repositories. So I'm going to call this first one customers repo. And we need to go up a few folders. We got to get back up to the lib. So we're going to go up about 3 levels here to lib, customers, repository. All right, now later in the course, we're also going to use a states repository. We don't need it right here, but I'm going to go ahead and add it. So this would be states repo and states repository, and that'll just grab a similar type of object that is capable of just querying all the states in the US, for instance. And then finally, for error handling, I'm just going to log to the console to keep it very simple. You could certainly add more robust loggers if you'd like, but I'm going to use a Node.js util module to do some of the logging. We'll see where that's used in just a moment. All right, so that's kind of step one. Now, if you're new to this, you'll notice that means I'm not going to write any data access code at all in the customer's controller. And that's good, especially from an architecture standpoint, because now if the database, for whatever reason, changed, and we have to rewrite the queries or whatever it may be, I'll never have to change the customer's controller code, the code that's going to actually serve up the JSON per se, assuming the interface of the data stays the same. That's a good thing. We're isolating ourselves from the actual data access. So now what we can do is really this customer's controller, the root route it's designed to handle is the folder structure, API/customers. That's what the router I talked through earlier will create for us. So it's going to create this API/customers route. Well, when that route is encountered, I want to use customers repo to go get the customers and return those. So the way we can do that is we can say, hey, when the router sees a GET request from the client to API/customers, now this is just an alias, this means the root of this router, which is API/customers, then I would like to call GET customers. Now I don't have that yet, but we're going to come down here and we're going to make a GET customers that takes a request and a response like that. Now, I could just do that, but I want to make sure that when this gets called, it's with the proper this, since we know in JavaScript this can be a little bit fun sometimes. So I'm going to bind the call to the current this. By doing that, I'll make sure it's called with the proper context. Okay, so that's kind of the first step. Now, from here, we need to use our customer's repo. So the first thing I'm going to do is just log that, hey, we made it in here. So we'll just log out, get customers. And now we want to use our customers repo to get customers. Now I'm going to use an arrow function to handle the error and the actual data we get back. So we'll use the ES2015 arrow syntax. And in here, I now need to check if we have an error. Now, if we do have an error, we're just going to log it to the console, and I'm going to use the response object's JSON function. Now, if you're new to that, this is how we can actually return JSON using Express. It's an Express feature. So ultimately, I want to do this. I'm going to just return nothing if we do get an error. Now, I certainly could return an object literal with some error object. We're going to keep it pretty simple and just keep all the error logging on the server side. So I'm going to log out console.log. We'll say get customers error. And this is where I'm going to use that util. It's a nice way you can write out the error object to the console. It gives you a little more nice insight into the error if you haven't seen that before. Now, in this particular app, this isn't actually going to get hit, but we should always handle that, which is why it's in here. All right, let's get to the good part, though. Now, if it works and we get data, then I'm just going to do a little logging that says get customers is okay. That way it's kind of easy to follow. And then we use response.json. And this time I don't want to return null. I want to get our data object here, and it's going to have a customers. Remember, there's a count and the customers. Well, I'm just going to return the customers. Now, later in the course, we'll see where that count is used for some paging operations. But for now, we're going to return all the customers. Okay, so we're ready to go there. So now we have a way to handle API/customers. That's what this represents. It's going to call get customers. We make sure it gets called with the appropriate context. And then we're going to use our customers repo. So again, notice I have no idea that this is actually calling MongoDB. It could be Postgres, it could be SQLite, it could be SQL Server, who knows? And that's what I want. I don't want my routing controller here, my action, to know anything about the database. Thin controllers, in other words. Keep everything very slimmed down. All right, so let's save that. Now later, as we move into the UI side with Angular, we're going to need to get states. And this controller is already done, but notice I'm going to do the same thing. I have a constructor. This would be API/states. That's what this guy represents. And it's going to call get states. And that uses a states repo. Same exact pattern. So once you get this pattern down, you're going to do the same thing over and over and over. Kind of a single responsibility type of approach where in your lib or whatever folder you decide to create, you put your different repository objects that query for different database objects. And then your routing code, which in my case is these controllers, is simply going to be responsible for calling into that to get the data. All right, so we're good to go there. We now have a way to get states, and we have a way to get customers. Now, does it work? Let's try it. So let's go into our terminal. I'm going to run this locally. Again, you could also use the Docker option I showed, but we're going to do MongoD to start up my MongoDB database. You can start up another terminal in the root of the project, or I just use a tab here to do it. And I'm going to run npm I first off. Now, I've already run that to save on time, but make sure you install the dependencies. And then we'll go ahead and run npm start. See what we get here. All right, don't see any error, so that's good. Now, I could pull this up in the browser, but my tool of choice by far to test out my RESTful services is Postman. So I already have this up, and I've already typed in the route to this API/customers that we just created. And if real quick though, if you're new to this, I mentioned it earlier, but this is a free tool. You can go to the Chrome web store and just go search for Postman and install it. And then once you start it up, you can now type in pass, you can do get, post, put, all the fun stuff. So we're going to do a send, and looks like it worked. Beautiful. Let's try out the API/states that I showed you. That was already done. And all right, excellent. And it looks like we already have our states as well. Now, we are going to work with, we do customers/some ID. In fact, here's one. If we go back to our customers, let's go grab that ID right there, which is probably the same one I just showed you. Send. Okay, now that didn't work. Notice it redirected us actually back to the home page. Okay, so we got a problem there. Well, we're going to be fixing that in the next section. But for this particular section, our job is done. We now have created a RESTful service API for the API/customers route, which calls our get customers, calls into Mongo, and gets our data, and then uses the express response JSON function to return that customer data back to the caller. Now that we've set up the RESTful service to return multiple customers, let's take a look at how we can return a single customer. To handle returning a single customer, we need a customer ID. So we already have the route set up to handle API customers, but I need to add another child route here that handles API customers / and then I'm going to make a route parameter. Now, this is something, again, that's provided by Express, the router that's part of Express, and we can just put a colon, put the name of the route parameter, and then we're kind of off and running. And now later I'll show you how we can pull that off and get to it. So let's come on in and we'll map this to a get customer. And then I like to add the bind I mentioned just to make sure the context is set appropriately. It's not actually going to be needed here, but it's something I like to follow. All right, so let's add a get customer that takes a request and a response. And we're going to do a similar thing here. So I'm just going to grab our logging statement to save a little typing. And once we do that, we can start to get to work here. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the ID. And the way we can do that is go into the request, go to the params property, and then go to ID. Now, I'm just going to assume that it is passed, but we certainly could add more code to say if it's not passed, throw an exception or assign it to 0 or something like that. Otherwise, it's possible we could get an undefined or null reference type error somewhere. But we'll go ahead and keep it pretty simple. Now, we already have our customer's repo. So I'm really after the same type of code that you'll see up here, but I'm just going to change it a little bit. So let's come on up. I'm just going to copy that down, change this to get customer, and now I need to add some code to handle the ID. So we already have the ID, but I need to pass it as the first parameter. So I'm going to pass ID here, and then we'll give it the callback if it's able to find the customer. So we'll change this real quick to get customer, and then I'm going to return the actual customer that we get back. So I'm just going to rename this to customer, since that's what we're going to get, and we would return that customer. All right, so same type of premise as before. We're going to use our customer's repo to get that customer. Let me jump in there really quickly to show you that code. And we're going to use this customer model to find by ID. It's one of the built-in functions on the model. There's the ID that we passed in here. And then there's our callback that's going to get invoked right here. And we'll hopefully get back the customer, or we're going to get back an error, one of the two. All right, so assuming this works, we get back a customer. So let me go ahead and save that. Now, I already have my console still running from the previous example. Notice it keeps restarting. So let me open up Postman again. Let's go back to all our customers again. Looks like that's still working. Let's try to grab this first customer now. So we're going to say customers slash, I'm going to put the ID. And let's send that. And it looks like it works. All right, so that's great. Let's just double check. Let's grab one more. Let's go down to another customer, or maybe this guy right here. So we get back Jesse, it looks like. And there we go, Jesse Smith. And we're good to go there. So it looks like we're working. So now we have the ability to return customers and a single customer by defining our routes and then mapping those routes to our functions. So now we have the at least get functionality, at least the core get functionality for the app ready to go. We're going to enhance this a little bit later, but we have enough now that we can start to move into the world of Angular and call this service. Now that we have a RESTful service capable of giving us customers and a single customer, it's time to integrate Angular with that Node.js Express RESTful service. So the first thing we're going to do here is go into our public area because I want to work with our data service that's already in this public app. So if I go into public app core, core again, I mentioned earlier in the course, represents my singleton objects. I only want a single instance of anything in core. You'll see I have this data service. So the first thing I'm going to do is get HTTP set up. Now, as a quick review, if I go to core module, you'll notice that I've already imported HTTP module, and I've added that to the imports. And so that'll make the HTTP client object available to my data service, and I can inject it. So let's go back to the data service, and let's import HTTP. And I'm going to grab a few other things we're going to be using throughout this particular service as well. So I'm going to grab a headers, which we'll get to later, response object, and request options. And we'll talk about the HTTP and response now. Later, we'll talk about headers and request options as we move through the course. I'm going to grab that from Angular HTTP. All right, so now that we have that, I also need to work with observables. And I talked about at the very beginning of the course the role of observables and how really they're like an array of data, a stream of data into the future. And although HTTP calls only give me one value, you can think of that as getting back an array of one item. So I need to set up my observables. Now this is not the most fun stuff to type, so I'm just going to grab a snippet here, and we'll talk it through it. So first off, I import observable from RxJS observable. If you recall, in public, we ran a gulp task to get this app up and running in the first place. And the gulp task automatically had the lib folder added. Now, if you don't see that lib folder, then you're going to want to go back to the console and run that gulp command, which is a copy command you'll see here, copy libs. And that will make sure that your node modules get copied in to your lib folder. Otherwise, when we try to reference RxJS observable and add Angular, if you don't have this lib folder, then you wouldn't have these different folders that we need. So I already have that, so we're pretty good to go there. All right, so I'm also importing some operators. I have map and catch. Now, map is going to allow us to map the incoming response to a callback function. And catch is going to allow me to actually catch errors, of course. Now, I also have a way I can add a throw capability, a throw function to observables. Now, I'm going to jump down here. We're not going to talk about it a lot, but I have a little handle error, and you'll notice at the very bottom, once it builds up what the data is, and also right here, I have this observable.throw. And this will throw an error, but it'll throw it as an observable. That way, whoever subscribes to the observable can also get to the error in kind of a normal way. And so that's a little callback error handler that we have that we're going to be using here in just a moment. All right, so those are some of the initial imports I need. We have our Angular imports, and then we have the observable, and our main things are operators we're going to be using. So now that we have that, I need to inject the HTTP object in. So I'm going to make a private option here, call it HTTP of type HTTP, and that'll handle our dependency injection. And because we've already imported HTTP module, the provider for this object will be, of course, available for us. All right, so the next thing we need to do is we need to work with getting customers and getting a single customer. So I don't currently have a function for that, but we're going to add it. So I'm going to add a get customers. It's going to return an observable of an iCustomer array. So I'm going to say iCustomer array here. So we're going to use a generic from TypeScript to say, yeah, I'm going to give you back an observable, whatever subscribes to this. But inside of that observable, I'm going to have this iCustomer that you can actually work with and use. Now, right now, iCustomer is actually not known. Okay, and if I go into my shared area here, you'll notice I have an interfaces.ts, and this is my iCustomer. So you can see some of the different properties it expects. But of course, I need to actually import that. So we're going to come on in and import that as well. So I'm going to actually import several from this interfaces file that we're going to be using throughout this data service. And we'll grab that from, move up a folder to shared interfaces. All right, that'll allow me to give kind of a strongly typed response type to whoever calls this get customers. So we'll go ahead and make that. All right, now inside of here, I want to be able to make an HTTP call, and I could hard code the actual URL. What I like to do, though, is come in and put a base URL or something like that that's a string. And this will be to the API/customers. Now, you'll recall that that matches, of course, exactly with what the RESTful service has. And so that's actually what we're going to call on the RESTful service here. So now I can come on in and I can go ahead and return an observable by calling http.get. We would like to get the base URL, call up to there. But because we're working with observables, a stream of data over time, I'm going to map the response we're going to get back. And in this case, we're going to just call it RES. That's going to be of type response. That's why I imported that earlier. We're going to map that into a function. So let me do an arrow function here. And this will be our map. And before I actually do the semicolon, recall that I imported the catch operator. So of course, you always want to be able to catch errors as well. And that's where I'm going to use the handle error that you saw down below. All right, so now we're set up to get to the response. Well, what I want to do is get my customers. So I'm going to say let customers equal response.json. That'll parse the JSON data in the response and give me back the customers. But the customers have some orders, and what I need to do is the server's not doing some totaling for the order total. Each customer needs an order total I want to be able to display. and that might be used as the app grows, for instance. So what I'm going to do is grab the customers that we're going to get back, but I actually want to call this calculate function, calculate customers' order total. And as you can see, that's just going to loop through each of the orders and update this total property. Pretty basic. So what I'm going to do is pass in my customers here. All right, so we're going to manipulate the data before I actually return it to whoever subscribed to get customers here. All right, so that'll kind of get us set up for that particular piece of functionality, and then we can go ahead and return it. Okay, so now we're starting to use our Angular functionality. So we have an Angular service called data service. We saw a little bit of this earlier. It, of course, has the injectable decorator on it so that we can handle injecting HTTP and that it works. We do all the imports of whatever we need, in this case, HTTP and response. And then I'm using some interfaces here as well, in this case, iCustomer. We've also imported observable so that I can use that as a return type, and I can use it to throw errors if I need. And then I have the map and the cache. So anytime you work with RxJS, you are going to be importing specifically what you need. It is possible to import everything it offers. I would not do that because that imports a tremendous amount of scripts. So just import the things you need, like you see I'm doing here. All right, so there's our get customers. So now a component could have data service injected into it, which we'll get to later, and then it can call get customers, and that'll return the customer's data that we need. Now we also need the ability to return a single customer. So let's add that. We're going to do an ID would have to be passed in, of course, as a string. This is also going to return an observable of, in this case, one customer, iCustomer. All right, now this one will be very similar to what we see above. We're going to return the observable by saying http.get. We're going to use that base URL that we defined up above, but I'm going to pass the ID. And I could have done the ES2015 string interpolation here, but I think this is just as easy as that option. So we're going to go ahead and just leave it like this. And then we'll come in and we're going to map the response. So we'll map that response object. And we need to, of course, get the JSON, parse that. Now this is going to be a very simple example, so I don't need to run the calculate customer order totals in this one. But of course, we also want to handle catching errors. So we'll just do the same thing. We'll call handle error. And so we should be good to go. So we have all the imports we need up here. We have the base URL that we're going to call. We've injected HTTP. And now we're going to use HTTP to actually call into our RESTful servers that we created earlier, get those customers, update some order totals for each customer, and then return them. So we're doing a little bit of cleanup work before the component that's going to call this service later actually gets the data. And then we've also added, of course, the capability to get a single customer. Now, before we go too much further and wrap up, let's see how we're doing compilation-wise with our TypeScript. So I still have my console running that's loading the RESTful service and also running the TypeScript compiler. If we look kind of down here at the bottom, it looks like some customer edit reactive and customer edit component. They both are looking for a get states on data service. Now, it says a property of get states, but in this case, it actually means a function. So we need to add a get states. And if you remember, I showed that we had a get states on our RESTful service. So let's go ahead and do that. Pretty easy. Now that we have already seen HTTP, it's really just the same thing. So we're going to say http.get. I'm just going to give it the URL here directly because we only use it once. And then we're going to come on in and we're going to map this again. Grab the response. And you can see the repetition now going on here. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy. And we're going to map this, just grab the JSON again, and we always want to handle catching the errors. We'll say handle error. Now I want to be specific, although I don't have to return what this is going to give us, which is an observable. I do want to be specific like we've done up here, but I have another interface called iState. So if we go back into the interfaces, iState is very, very simple. Abbreviation and name are only required. Let's go ahead and add that as the return type here for our get states. We'll say :observable of iState, and this is going to be an array. All right, and we'll be in business. So we now have a get states, returns an observable of a state array, and we have the capability to do that. So let's save it. Let's go back to the console, and all right, now it looks good. You'll notice that compilation completed. There was a file change detected, which I just saved, and then it actually updated that, and so we're pretty much good to go. So the last major piece here is we now have our data service, which at least has our initial get operations. But I need to add data service into my core module. So my core module is all my singletons I mentioned. So I'm just going to import data service. We're going to grab that from our local folder, data.service. And we need to add data service as a provider. So I'm going to say data service, and that way, when some other components need data service, we can inject it. It'll look at the providers here and know what to do. So let me save that. Let's go back to our console here, and everything looks good. All right, so we have several file changes occurred, and we're still good to go.